What happens when a man makes one careless joke, and the woman it's aimed at takes him completely seriously? Mason Cole was 32 years old, raising a little girl alone and barely holding his life together. One evening, trying to be funny in front of his best friend, he told that friend's mother she was more elegant than any woman he had ever dated. She didn't laugh. She looked at him across the room and asked if he was free for dinner on Saturday. And just like that, one stupid sentence detonated 3 lives at once. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The night it happened, Mason Cole had not intended to stay long. He told himself that before pulling into Grant's driveway, just a quick stop, maybe 45 minutes, grab a beer, catch up on the game, and get back home before Lily woke up from her nap and panicked not finding him in the house. Lily was 6, and she still had nights where she woke up screaming and needed to find him standing in the doorway of her room before she'd settle back down. He'd learned not to cut those evenings too close, but Grant Sullivan had a way of stretching things out. He always had. 23 years of friendship had taught Mason that walking into Grant's place for a quick beer was roughly the same as agreeing to stay for 3 hours. Grant talked too much, poured too heavy, and had a gift for making the next subject feel more interesting than the one before it. So you kept saying, okay, one more until you realized it was 11:30 and you'd eaten half a bag of pretzels for dinner. Mason sat on the worn leather couch in the Sullivan living room, one boot up on the edge of the coffee table. Grant had stopped caring about that years ago, and listened to Grant finish a story about a contractor who had somehow managed to flood 2 floors of a downtown office building while supposedly waterproofing one bathroom. Grant worked in commercial real estate and collected disaster stories the way other people collected sports memorabilia. Every few weeks there was a new one. So he calls me at 6 in the morning, Grant was saying, stretched out in the armchair across from Mason with a beer balanced on his knee. And the first thing out of his mouth, the absolute first thing, is, "Did you get my invoice?" Mason laughed. It was a real laugh, not the polite kind. He sent the invoice. He sent the invoice before calling the building owner. That's professional commitment. That's a lawsuit is what it is. Grant took a drink. I'm going to be dealing with this until Christmas. Maybe longer. You love it. I hate it. You love it, Mason said. You'd be bored inside a week if everything went clean. Grant pointed at him. That is an ugly thing to say, and you know me too well. Mason smiled and set his beer down on the coffee table, rolling his neck to the side until it popped. He was tired in the particular way that had become his baseline over the past 4 years. Not the sharp, desperate exhaustion of the early months after Claire died, but a steady background hum of fatigue that lived between his shoulder blades and behind his eyes. He'd gotten used to it. You got used to things. That was what nobody told you beforehand. Not how devastating grief was, everyone mentioned that, but how quickly your whole system recalibrated around whatever the new weight was, until you forgot what lightness had felt like. He heard footsteps on the staircase. Grant's mother had always moved quietly through spaces. Mason had noticed that years ago, the first time he'd come to this house as a 14-year-old kid and met the composed, dark-haired woman who seemed slightly too polished for the suburban neighborhood, too deliberate in the way she spoke, like someone who had long ago learned to measure every word before releasing it. Back then, Victoria Sullivan had been 32. Exactly Mason's age now, which was a thought he'd had recently and found mildly disorienting. And she had just been given custody of Grant after a divorce that, from the fragments Mason had gathered over the years, had not been pleasant. She had raised Grant in this house alone, built her company at the same time. Mason knew the broad outlines of it from things Grant mentioned. Sullivan Meridian, a financial services and investment consulting group that now operated in 11 cities, which Victoria had grown from a boutique advisory firm of 4 people into something that employed over 800. Grant didn't talk about it much in terms of the actual accomplishment. It was just his mother's company, the way the house was just the house. When you grew up inside something, it stopped having edges. Victoria appeared at the bottom of the stairs holding a tablet under one arm, dressed in what Mason recognized as the kind of clothes people wore when they'd been working from home but still took it seriously. Dark trousers, a pale blouse, her hair pinned back in a way that was functional but not careless. She was 60. He knew that because Grant's birthday was in April and her birthday was in March, and Grant had mentioned, with his usual mix of guilt and logistical exhaustion, that back-to-back birthday dinners were doing things to my restaurant budget. "I didn't know you were here," Victoria said, not unkindly, addressing Mason. "He showed up 40 minutes ago and hasn't left," Grant said. "That tracks," Mason said. The corner of Victoria's mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the shape of one. She had that quality he'd noticed for years, the ability to be slightly amused without committing to it, which either meant she had excellent emotional control or a very dry sense of humor, and from what Mason had observed, it was probably both. She walked toward the kitchen. "I'm making tea. I'll leave you two to your sports injury analysis or whatever it is." "Contractor flooding," Grant said. "Even better." And then Mason, tired, relaxed, not thinking carefully about anything, operating on approximately 1.5 beers and the comfortable looseness of being in a room where he'd spent half his adolescence, said the thing. He said it because it was the kind of dumb, throwaway comment that felt harmless in the moment. The kind that men said around their friends and immediately forgot. He said it because Victoria's posture as she crossed the room, the unhurried way she carried herself, the way her presence somehow made the whole living room feel slightly more organized just by passing through it, struck him in that particular moment as genuinely striking. And because he'd been on approximately 3 dates in 4 years, all of them forgettable, all of them ending in polite mutual acknowledgement that neither party was ready for anything, the comparison arrived in his head fully formed and came out of his mouth before any editorial function engaged. He said, "You know, your mom is more elegant than any woman I've ever actually taken on a date." He said it to Grant. He meant it as a joke, not about Victoria exactly, but about himself, about the sad state of his romantic history. Grant would understand it that way. It was the kind of self-deprecating humor they'd traded for 2 decades. Grant made a face that Mason couldn't immediately read, something between a wince and an expression of preemptive horror. And then Victoria stopped walking. She didn't turn around immediately. There was a pause, 2 seconds, maybe 3, in which Mason understood, with the particular clarity that only arrives after you've already made a mistake, that the comment had not landed the way he'd intended, that it had traveled past Grant, who had heard it as the joke it was, and been received by the other person in the room in some entirely different register. Victoria turned around. She was looking directly at him. "Are you free Saturday?" she said. Mason blinked. "What?" "For dinner." She wasn't smiling. She wasn't embarrassed. She looked like she was confirming the time of a quarterly review. "You said you found me elegant. I'm asking if you'd like to have dinner." The room was completely silent. Grant had set his beer down. Mason opened his mouth and then closed it. He was aware, in a distant way, that his face was doing something terrible. I was joking. I didn't mean, "I know you were joking," Victoria said, still calm, still looking at him directly. "But I'm not." She turned back around and walked into the kitchen. The sound of the kettle being filled came through the doorway. Mason turned to Grant. Grant was staring at the middle distance with the expression of a man who had just watched a controlled demolition collapse slightly off target. "Grant." "Don't," Grant said. "I didn't mean—" "I know you didn't." Grant picked his beer back up. "Don't." Mason left 20 minutes later. He told himself that on the drive home, across 4 miles of quiet suburban roads, with his hands at 10 and 2 and his brain running the same 30 seconds on a loop, he said it was a joke. She knows it was a joke. She was being, what, ironic? Demonstrating something? Calling his bluff? He pulled into his driveway. He sat in the car for a while. Through the downstairs window, he could see the babysitter on the couch, the pale flicker of the television. Lily was still asleep upstairs, presumably, which meant the night had been fine, which meant he hadn't needed to rush home after all. He thought about Victoria Sullivan standing in her living room, 60 years old, tablet under her arm, looking at him with zero apology and asking if he was free on Saturday. "I'm not joking." He went inside. The next 3 weeks, Mason avoided Grant's house. This required active effort, because under normal circumstances, he went over there roughly twice a month. They didn't live in each other's pockets the way they had in their 20s, but they maintained the comfortable frequency of two people who had outlasted enough life events together that the friendship had long since stopped requiring maintenance. You just showed up. You just called. The infrastructure of it was invisible because it had been built so slowly over so many years. Now Mason found reasons not to. He was busy with Lily. He was behind on a project at work. He did structural assessments for a regional engineering firm, mostly commercial properties, occasionally residential, work that required enough focus that he could legitimately claim it ran long. He texted Grant occasionally, short normal exchanges about nothing, and Grant responded the same way, and neither of them mentioned what had happened, which made everything feel worse in a particular way Mason couldn't fully articulate. It wasn't that he felt guilty about a joke. It was that Victoria's response had done something he hadn't expected. It had made him take the joke seriously, which was absurd. He knew it was absurd. He was 32 years old. She was 60. She was his best friend's mother, which was the kind of sentence that wrote its own punchline. She had built a company that was written up in business publications. She was, in every measurable sense, operating in a category of life entirely separate from his own. But the calm way she had looked at him, the absence of embarrassment, the fact that she had assessed the situation in real time and responded not with deflection or laughter or the polite social performance of pretending the comment hadn't happened, but with a direct and unqualified statement of interest. He turned it over at inconvenient moments. While running estimates on a 40-unit apartment complex outside the city, while loading the dishwasher after Lily's dinner, while lying awake at 2 a.m, which was when most of his thinking happened whether he wanted it to or not. He thought about Claire, inevitably. He always did, eventually, when his brain wandered into this territory, which happened rarely enough that he'd stopped feeling guilty about the rarity. Claire had been 26 when she died. Aggressive brain cancer, diagnosed in the fall, gone by the following July. Lily had been 2. Mason had been 28 and had spent the following 2 years in a fog that he only recognized as a fog, in retrospect, because while he was inside it, it had just felt like life. You functioned. You did what was in front of you. You took Lily to daycare and picked her up and fed her and read to her and got her into bed, and then sat in the kitchen at 9 o'clock at night and felt the specific weight of a house that was quieter than it was supposed to be. He'd climbed out of it, mostly. Lily helped. Lily was, at 6, an almost unreasonably intact human being who wanted to learn about volcanoes and had strong opinions about which dinosaurs were underrated, and still sometimes reached up to hold his hand in the cereal aisle, which was the kind of small thing that could undo him completely if he let it. She was the organizing principle of his life. He told himself that was enough for now, that the rest, the parts of life that Claire had filled, could wait until he'd figured out something he hadn't yet been able to name. He ran into Victoria at the farmer's market on a Saturday morning in late October. He was standing at a produce table trying to determine whether Lily would eat chard if he chopped it small enough and hidden it inside something else, which was the kind of parenting calculation that took longer than it should. He heard someone say his name and turned around. Victoria was standing about 6 feet away with a canvas bag over one arm, also holding a bundle of something leafy, also apparently mid-assessment. She looked different from when he saw her at Grant's house. Still put together, but differently. The kind of Saturday morning version of someone that was slightly softer than the weekday version. Her hair was down. His brain did something slightly embarrassing before he regulated it. "Victoria," he said. "Hey." "Chard," she said, glancing at what he was holding. "What are you cooking?" "I'm not sure yet. I'm trying to figure out if I can hide it." "In pasta," she said. "Wilted down with garlic and olive oil, then toss it with pasta and parmesan. My son ate things for years without knowing what they were. It's not deceptive, it's just strategic." "That's a kind way to put it." She almost smiled. "How's Lily?" He was slightly thrown by the fact that she remembered Lily's name. He shouldn't have been. Victoria was not someone who forgot things, but it still caught him off guard. "She's good. She's at home with her grandmother this morning. She had a soccer game yesterday, and she's insufferably pleased with herself because she scored twice." "She should be pleased with herself." "Yeah," Mason said. "I told her that. She's milking it." There was a pause. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was aware of itself. They were both aware of what they weren't talking about. "I owe you an apology," Mason said finally. "What I said at Grant's,
The comment I made, that was careless, and I should have. You already apologized. I know, but I want to make sure you know I wasn't being Mason. She said his name cleanly, not unkindly. I know what you were doing. I'm not offended. I made you uncomfortable, and I shouldn't have put you in that position. I was. She paused, and for the first time he saw something in her face that wasn't entirely composed. I was surprised by my own reaction, honestly. I don't do that. I don't say things like that to people, especially not to my son's friends. It's okay, he said. It's not, entirely. She adjusted the canvas bag on her arm. But we can agree to pretend it was a slightly unusual evening and move on. Yeah, Mason said. We can do that. She nodded. She looked at the chard he was still holding. Garlic and olive oil, parmesan at the end. Don't skip the parmesan. Noted. She walked away. He stood at the produce table for a moment longer than he needed to. The chard was still in his hand. Around him the market moved in its Saturday morning way, unhurried, full of strollers and dogs and people who had more time than purpose. He bought the chard. He made the pasta. Lily ate 2 bowls and did not once ask what the green things were. He saw her again the following week. This one was not accidental, or not entirely. Grant had called to say he was having some people over on a Sunday afternoon, a loose, low-key thing, some people from work and a couple of other friends. And did Mason want to come by? Mason had said yes, had arranged for Lily to spend the afternoon with Claire's mother, and had driven over telling himself that it was just Grant's place and that Victoria probably wouldn't even be there. She was usually traveling for work. Grant mentioned that constantly. My mother is always somewhere. I've started thinking of her time zone as hypothetical. She was there. She was in the kitchen when he arrived, talking to 2 of Grant's colleagues, a man and a woman, both mid-30s, the kind of people who worked in commercial real estate and could discuss cap rates at a Sunday afternoon gathering without it feeling strange. Victoria was listening more than talking, but when she spoke, the other 2 sort of organized themselves around whatever she'd said, which Mason noticed in the way you notice something without quite deciding to. She was wearing a dark green sweater. He filed that information away and then was annoyed at himself for filing it. Grant found him near the food table, and they spent half an hour in the comfortable back and forth of their normal dynamic, and the thing from 3 weeks ago sat between them like a small, inert object neither of them wanted to move. Grant didn't mention it. Mason didn't mention it. They talked about the soccer league Lily had joined and the contractor lawsuit and a movie Grant had seen that he described as 2 hours of people making extremely bad decisions in beautiful locations, which Mason said sounded like most movies, and Grant said fair point. At some point in the afternoon, the small group fragmented and reorganized the way it always does at those things, and Mason ended up near the back door with a beer, and Victoria ended up nearby a few minutes later. You came, she said. I was invited. Grant mentioned he called you. Did he tell you he called me? She looked at him steadily. Yes. Mason decided that was something he could think about later. Should I have not come? Of course you should have come, she said. He's your friend. This is his house. It's also your house. I don't live here anymore. She glanced around the backyard. The old table, the grill Grant never cleaned properly, the oak tree at the edge of the property that had been shedding leaves for weeks. I haven't lived here in 12 years. I just never saw the point of selling it. Grant likes having it. Where do you live? She named an address in a part of the city Mason knew slightly. An older neighborhood near the water, quiet, the kind of streets with big trees and houses set back from the road. I bought a place there when Grant started college. I thought it was time to... She paused. I thought it was time to have a home that was only mine. And is it? It's very quiet, she said, not quite answering the question. They stood there for a moment. The afternoon was the specific gray of late October, cool enough to make the beer feel slightly wrong, but not cold enough to go inside. Can I ask you something? Mason said. She waited. When you said you weren't joking, at Grant's, he kept his voice level. What did you mean by that? Victoria looked at him. She didn't rush anything. She had this way of letting silence sit without filling it, which he was coming to understand was characteristic rather than evasive. I meant that I was interested, she said finally, and that I'm old enough to not pretend I'm not when I am. You're aware that's complicated. Yes,
She looked down at her tea. I'm 60 years old, Mason. I've run a company for 30 years. I've raised a son alone. I know what complicated looks like. She glanced up. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm just telling you the truth, because I've found that honesty, even inconvenient honesty, tends to make things cleaner eventually. And if it makes things messier first, then it makes things messier first, she said simply. That's usually how it works. Mason turned that over. Behind them, through the back door, he could hear Grant saying something that made two other people laugh. I have a 6-year-old, he said. I know. And you're Grant's mother. I'm aware. And the age difference is 28 years, Victoria said. Yes, I know the math. He looked at her. The gray afternoon light was doing something unflattering, and she still looked exactly like herself, which he thought was probably the most telling thing about a person, how they looked in bad light when nothing was staged. What do you want from me? He asked. It came out more direct than he'd planned, but she'd set that tone. Nothing right now, she said. I'm not in a hurry. Another pause. I thought you should know that what I said was real. Whatever you do with that is entirely your decision. She went back inside a few minutes later. Mason stood in the backyard with his beer going warm in his hand for longer than made sense. October became November. Mason saw Victoria twice more in the following weeks. Once at a gallery opening, Grant had dragged him to with the half-hearted argument that it'll be quick. They have good wine. The artist is someone I need to maintain a relationship with, which was the kind of sentence only Grant could say without irony. Victoria had been there for the first 40 minutes, in a group on the other side of the room, and they had exchanged exactly one look across the space, brief, acknowledged, then mutually released. And Mason had spent the rest of the evening slightly off his own footing. The second time was different. The second time they were alone. He'd gone to the Sullivan house on a Wednesday evening to drop off a book Grant had lent him 3 months ago and repeatedly said he didn't need back, but Mason's conscience had been nagging at it. He'd knocked, and Grant had not been there. Forgot he had some work dinner, Mason realized. But Victoria had answered the door. She'd looked at the book. He's going to tell you he didn't need that back. I know. My conscience needed the closure. She held the door open without discussing it, and Mason had stepped inside, and somehow, neither of them able to identify exactly how it happened, he was in the kitchen and she was making tea again, and they were talking. The thing about talking to Victoria Sullivan was that it didn't have the particular self-consciousness that he'd noticed in other conversations since Claire died. That faint, hovering awareness that the other person was being careful around him, measuring what they said against the invisible fact of his loss. Victoria didn't talk to him carefully. She talked to him directly, and when she asked questions, she actually waited for the answer. And when she had an opinion, she said it without first preparing him for the fact that she had one. They talked about Lily, about what it was like raising a child alone, really raising one. Not the theoretical version, but the version with sick days and school forms, and the specific loneliness of being the only adult in the house when something went sideways and there was no one to look at and say, "Is this as bad as I think it is?" Victoria had raised Grant alone from the time he was 8. Mason didn't know the whole story, still didn't, but he knew it had been hard in ways that she didn't advertise. There's something nobody prepares you for, she said, holding her mug, not looking at him. Looking past him at the window over the sink. You become entirely competent at everything because you have to. And it's good in a lot of ways. You stop waiting for someone else to fix things. You just fix them. She paused. But after a while, competence starts to feel like a wall you built that you can't get back over. Mason said, "Yeah, you know what I mean. I had 4 years of, I can handle anything now," Mason said. Car breaks down, water heater goes out, Lily's sick at midnight, 3 things due at work at the same time. I just do it. I don't even panic anymore, and I don't know if that's healthy or if something broke. It's both, Victoria said, usually both. He looked at her. I don't know. Does it get easier, the solo part? She thought about it honestly, which he appreciated. It gets more familiar. Easier is the wrong word. She brought her eyes back to him. You stop grieving the other version of things and you start living the version you actually have. How long does that take? Longer than you'd like, she said. Less than you're afraid of. He sat with that. He drove home an hour later thinking about the fact that he hadn't once thought about the 28-year age difference during that conversation. Not because he'd forgotten it, but because it had seemed, for that particular hour, like the least interesting thing in the room. Date. The following Saturday, Lily woke up at 5:40 in the morning and arrived in Mason's doorway with her blanket and the expression of someone who had important news. Dad? He pulled the pillow off his face. Lily. I've been thinking, she said. This was never a sentence that ended quickly. Okay. Marcus said his mom knows someone who was in a volcano. Mason waited. In a volcano. Like near one. On a boat near one. In Hawaii. And I want to know if we can go to Hawaii to see the volcano. That's a big trip, Bug. I know. She climbed onto the bed and settled herself beside him in the manner of someone who had no intention of going anywhere. We could save up. We could save up, he agreed. How long would that take? Probably a while. That's okay. She was quiet for a moment, the blanket pulled up. Dad? Yeah. Are you lonely? He turned his head to look at her. She was 6. She asked things like this out of nowhere and meant them genuinely, with no particular agenda. Sometimes, he said. She nodded, processing this. Me too. Sometimes. He put his arm around her and she settled into his side, and they were both quiet for a while. Outside, the sky was just starting to change. He thought about what Victoria had said. You stop grieving the other version of things and you start living the version you actually have. He didn't know what that version was supposed to look like yet, but for the first time in a while, he felt something that was at least adjacent to wanting to find out. The last Friday of November, Mason sat in his car in a parking lot across from a coffee shop for 11 minutes before going in. He had texted Victoria 3 days earlier. The message had taken him 20 minutes to write and had ended up being 14 words. I've been thinking about what you said at Grant's house. Can we talk? She had replied in under 2 minutes. Coffee. Friday. There's a place on Harrow and 5th I like. He had said yes before he talked himself out of it. And now he was sitting in the parking lot at 7:50 in the morning with the engine off, watching people walk past on the sidewalk, trying to figure out if there was a version of this that was not complicated and eventually concluding that there wasn't, but that he was going in anyway. Grant didn't know. That fact sat in his chest like something with weight and sharp edges. Grant was his oldest friend, the person who had shown up at the hospital when Claire was diagnosed, who had driven Mason home from that appointment because Mason had forgotten, in the shock of it, that he'd driven there himself. Grant, who was 32 years old and still called his mother every Sunday without fail, who talked about her with the complicated mix of pride and exhaustion and love that was probably the only accurate emotional response to having been raised by Victoria Sullivan. Mason was going to have to tell him. He didn't know when, but he knew he couldn't let this, whatever this was, move forward without Grant knowing. He got out of the car. He walked across the street and into the coffee shop, and Victoria was already there at a table by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup, watching him come through the door. She looked, as she always did, like she'd thought about things further than he had. He sat down across from her. You came, she said. I said I would. People say things. Not me, Mason said. She looked at him for a moment. The morning light came through the window at a low angle and hit the side of her face, and he noticed again, the same thing he'd noticed in the gray October light at Grant's backyard, that she looked exactly like herself. No performance, no management of impression. So, he said. So, she said. Outside, the street was doing its Friday morning thing, unhurried, people on their way to places, the particular temporary piece of a city that hasn't fully woken up yet. I don't know what I'm doing, Mason said honestly. I want to be clear about that. I know, Victoria said. Neither do I. Good, Mason said. At least we're starting from the same place. She almost smiled. We never start from the same place, Mason. No, he said. I guess we don't. The The coffee arrived. Neither of them moved to change the subject. And outside, November turned over into December. And the light went flat and clear the way it does right before winter really commits. And inside that particular coffee shop on Harrow and Fifth, two people sat across from each other at a small table and began, very carefully, with full knowledge of what it was going to cost, to tell each other the truth. The coffee at Harrow and Fifth was better than Mason expected, which felt like a small mercy given everything else about that morning was tilted slightly off its axis. They didn't talk about anything significant for the first 20 minutes. That surprised him. He'd walked in braced for something, a direct conversation, the kind Victoria seemed to prefer, where things were named and placed on the table without ceremony. But instead she asked about Lily's soccer league, and he asked about a trip she'd mentioned taking to Chicago, and they talked about the coffee shop itself, which she'd been coming to for years, which had survived the renovation of the entire block around it by being stubbornly identical from one decade to the next. The ceiling was the original tin. The chairs didn't match. The woman behind the counter knew Victoria's order without being told. "You come here a lot," Mason said. "When I need to think," she said. "It's loud enough that you stop hearing your own thoughts quite so clearly." He looked around at the Friday morning crowd. A mix of people on laptops, people in work clothes eating quickly, two older men in the corner playing chess with the focused silence of people who had been playing chess together for years. The noise was present, but not oppressive. It had the quality of background that didn't demand anything from you. "Is that why you suggested it for this?" he asked. Victoria looked at him over her cup. "Maybe." He decided not to push that. He turned his cup on the table instead, a small fidgeting motion he'd had since he was a kid, and tried to figure out how to say the thing he'd actually come to say. "I've been going back and forth," he said finally. "Since Grant's. About whether I'm reading the whole thing wrong. Whether you were being—" "I wasn't being anything other than what I said," Victoria told him. "I don't have the energy at my age to be cryptic. It's not efficient." "Right." He almost smiled. "That's okay. So you meant it." "I meant it. And you've thought about the fact that this would be—" He stopped, restructured. "Grant is my oldest friend. I've known him since we were 9 years old." "I'm aware." Her voice was even but not cold. "I've known him his entire life. He has a slight advantage over you on that front." "So you understand what this would—" "Yes," she said, simply. "I understand exactly what this would do. I've been thinking about little else since October." She set her cup down. "That's why I've spent 6 weeks not suggesting dinner again." He looked at her. She looked back. "What are you suggesting?" he said. "I'm not suggesting anything right now." She glanced down briefly, then back up. "I'm here because you texted me, which is a different thing." "I texted you because I couldn't stop thinking about what you said." "I know, and I'm not sure if that's—" "I don't know what to do with that, Victoria. I have a daughter, and a best friend, and a life that barely holds together as it is, and I don't—" He stopped. He could hear himself rambling, and he didn't like it. He pressed a hand flat against the table and started over. "I liked talking to you. That night at Grant's house when you made tea. I liked it more than I expected to, and I've been trying to figure out what that means, and I keep getting stuck on all the reasons why it can't mean anything." Victoria was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable quiet. Her particular kind, where she was actually processing something rather than waiting for an opening. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "Yeah. I've spent 30 years making decisions." She said it without pride, just as description. "Large ones. The kind that affect a lot of people. I bought a company and built it into something and made calls along the way that I knew would have consequences I couldn't fully predict. And I got comfortable with that, with deciding in uncertainty, without complete information, and accepting that you don't get to know in advance whether you're right." She paused. "I'm not saying this is the same thing, but I've noticed that the things I've regretted most in my life were not the decisions that turned out badly. They were the ones I didn't make because the timing wasn't perfect." Mason sat with that. "The timing is very far from perfect," he said. "Yes, Victoria agreed. "It is. And Grant is where this gets genuinely hard," she said, and something changed slightly in her voice. Not softness exactly, but a kind of careful weight, the way someone speaks about a thing that actually costs them.
He's my son. His comfort in this matters more to me than... She stopped, recalibrated.
I would not pursue anything that caused a permanent break between him and the people he loves. That's not a condition I'm placing on this. That's just who I am. What if there's no version of this that doesn't do that? She didn't answer immediately. Outside, a delivery truck double parked on the street, and someone honked and life continued in its indifferent way. I don't know, Victoria said. I think that's what we'd have to find out. They sat for another 45 minutes. They didn't make any decisions or agreements. They talked about other things, her company, the year she'd almost sold it and then didn't, the specific loneliness of leading an organization where the gap between you and everyone else was too wide for genuine friendship. He told her about this first year after Claire, the parts he didn't usually tell people. Not the grief itself, which everyone already assumed, but the strange practical surrealism of it, the way the DM5 forms asked for spousal information for years afterward, and he kept having to explain it to strangers at counters, who then looked at him the way people look at car accidents. She listened without managing her expression around it. She didn't say I'm sorry in that particular way people said it when they wanted to close the subject. She said that's exhausting, and meant the administrative grind of grief specifically, not grief in general, and he'd been so surprised by the precision of it that he'd actually laughed. When he left the coffee shop, it was almost 10. He stood on the sidewalk outside, and Victoria stood a few feet away with her canvas bag, always the canvas bag, and they looked at each other in the gray December light. What do we do? He said. I think that depends on what you want, she said. He wanted to say he didn't know, but standing there on Harrow and Fifth with the winter coming in and a woman looking at him with the specific patience of someone who has stopped requiring the world to be simpler than it is, he was aware that actually, underneath all the very reasonable complications, he did know. I'll call you, he said. Okay, she said. She walked to her car. He walked to his. He sat for a moment with the engine running and the heat coming on and thought about the fact that he was going to have to talk to Grant and that he had no idea how, and that he was going to do it anyway. Not today, but soon. He pulled out of the parking lot and drove toward home. The trees on the residential streets had gone mostly bare. December had that particular stripped-down quality where everything showed its actual structure without the cover of leaves, but you could see the shapes of things more clearly, the branching, the underlying form. He noticed that kind of thing more than he used to. Lily had a way of pointing at ordinary things and making you look at them directly, and the habit had started to stick. He thought about the way Victoria had said, I don't have the energy to be cryptic. It's not efficient, and smiled at the road ahead of him. He thought, surprisingly, about his mother, who had raised him and his sister in a house where directness was considered a form of respect, where saying the thing you meant was more courteous than wrapping it in soft language so no one had to feel it land. He'd always been like that, and it had made certain relationships easier and certain relationships much harder, and Claire had loved it and also occasionally said, Mason, not everyone is ready for full honesty at 8 in the morning, and she had been right. He wondered what Claire would make of this situation. He did that sometimes, ran things past the version of her that lived in his memory, knowing the answers were his own and not hers, but the exercise was still useful somehow. He thought she would probably find it very strange. He thought she would also, after a moment, ask him what Victoria was like, because Claire's first instinct about people was always curiosity rather than judgment. He was home by 10:30. Lily was at school. The house was quiet. He made coffee he didn't need and stood at the kitchen counter and thought about the fact that for the first time in 4 years, he was contemplating something that existed outside the established structure of his life. Outside work, outside Lily, outside the narrow, competent groove he'd cut for himself in the world. And the feeling was not comfortable, but it was awake. It felt like something that was awake. He texted Grant, "Free this week? Want to catch up?" Grant replied within minutes, "Thursday works. Come by after work." Mason put his phone face down on the counter. Thursday was 5 days away. He saw Victoria once more before Thursday, and it was not planned. He was picking Lily up from school on Tuesday and standing on the sidewalk with the other parents in the particular social configuration of pickup. Familiar faces, brief nods, the low hum of conversation about weekend plans and school fundraisers, when his phone buzzed with a number he'd only recently saved. "I'm driving past Lily's school right now, which feels ridiculous to mention, but I thought you should know I'm not following you. I have a client meeting 2 blocks from here." He stared at the text for a second and then laughed. A real one, short and unexpected. And the woman standing next to him gave him a brief look. He typed back, "I believe you, mostly." Her reply, "That's fair." He looked up and scanned the street reflexively, and there, 1 car back from the intersection, was a dark gray sedan that he didn't recognize but that slowed briefly as it passed, and he thought he caught a glimpse of her in profile, and then the light changed and the car moved on. He stood there on the sidewalk with his phone in his hand and the parents around him talking about the school carnival, and he was aware that he was smiling in a way that was not about the school carnival. Lily appeared through the doors at 3:15 with her backpack hanging off one shoulder and an expression of extreme importance. "Dad," she said, "I need to tell you something." "Okay?" "Mrs. Fredericks says I have the best volcano presentation in the class." He squatted down to her level. "She said that?" "She said it was the most detailed, which means best." "That's not exactly—" He looked at her face. "Yeah, that means best." Lily nodded with the gravity of someone receiving confirmation of a long-held belief. She took his hand as they walked to the car, and she talked the entire way about volcanoes, and about how magma was called magma when it was underground and lava when it came out, which she considered an unnecessary complication in the naming system. And Mason listened and responded at the right moments, and drove toward home with one hand on the wheel and the particular feeling in his chest that he'd identified as both the best and hardest thing about being a parent. The way their completeness made you aware of everything you couldn't shelter them from. He thought about Victoria saying you become entirely competent, and it's good in a lot of ways. And then, but after a while, competence starts to feel like a wall you built that you can't get back over. He'd been thinking about that a lot. More specifically, he'd been thinking about whether he'd built that wall himself, or whether it had just assembled around him while he was focused on other things, the way certain structures do, gradually, almost invisibly, until one day you look up and realize you're enclosed. At dinner, Lily ate her pasta and told him she'd decided they should definitely go to Hawaii. "I think we should go next summer," she said. "Next summer might be—" "I'll start saving," she said. "I have $14. "That's a start," Mason said. "I can do chores." "You already do chores." "Extra chores," she said. "Chores I don't currently do." "Like what?" She thought about it seriously. "I could learn to vacuum." "The vacuum is almost as tall as you are." "I can stand on something." He looked at her across the dinner table, this specific small human who had his nose and Claire's stubbornness and her own ideas about volcanic nomenclature, and felt the full impossible weight of loving someone this much. It didn't flatten into anything simpler with time. It just got more specific. After she was in bed, he sat on the back porch with a beer in the cold December air and thought about Thursday. He thought about what he was going to say to Grant. He ran through versions of it and discarded them. The honest version was the only one that was going to work. Grant would see through anything else, had always been able to, which was the double edge of a long friendship. The person who knew you well enough to show up when things were bad also knew you well enough to know when you were managing information. He thought about how Grant talked about his mother. There was a pattern to it, pride and frustration in roughly equal measure, the familiar structure of adult children who had been shaped by a very particular parent. Grant admired her. He was also, in ways he didn't always articulate, in competition with a version of her he'd never quite be. He sometimes talked about her company the way someone talked about a sibling they'd been compared to. Mason didn't know how Grant was going to respond to this. He genuinely didn't. He'd known the man for 23 years, and he still couldn't predict it, which was either a failure of imagination or an accurate reflection of how strange the situation was. He finished the beer, he went inside. He checked that Lily's nightlight was on and stood in her doorway for a moment the way he always did. She was fully asleep, sideways across the bed in the way she always managed, despite starting out straight. And then he went to bed himself. He didn't sleep for a while. Thursday arrived with the specific indifference of Thursdays. Mason worked through the day on a structural assessment for a mixed-use development downtown. The kind of project that required enough concentration to keep him from thinking too much about the evening, which was probably why he moved through it more efficiently than usual. He filed the report by 4:30, which was 40 minutes ahead of schedule, and drove to Grant's house. Grant answered the door with a beer already in hand, which Mason took as a good sign, and they settled into the living room in the usual configuration. Mason on the couch, Grant in the armchair, the familiar geography of two people who had been having versions of this same conversation for 2 decades. They talked for an hour about normal things. The lawsuit had settled. Grant was looking at a new property in the western part of the city. Lily had announced her intention to attend a volcano at the earliest possible opportunity. Normal things. And then there was a pause in the conversation, and Grant looked at him, and Mason knew that Grant already knew that Mason had something to say. That was the thing about long friendships. The pauses had shapes. "So," Grant said. "Yeah," Mason said. Grant waited. Mason put his beer down. He'd thought about how to start this 100 times, and none of the versions had felt right, so he just went with the direct one. "I've been seeing your mother." Silence. Not long silence, maybe 4 seconds, but the kind of silence that changes the air quality in a room. "Seeing," Grant said. "Not. We've had coffee twice. We've talked. Nothing has—" He stopped. "Nothing physical has happened. But I needed to tell you because I didn't want to keep not telling you." Grant was looking at him with an expression Mason couldn't quite read. It wasn't anger yet. It was something earlier than anger. The moment before a decision gets made about what to feel. "You've been having coffee with my mother," Grant said slowly. "Yes." "Since when?" Since the market in October. We ran into each other." Mason kept his voice steady. "And then the Sunday you had people over. And then last Friday, we met intentionally." Grant put his own beer down. He looked at the floor for a moment, then at the wall, then back at Mason. "That night," he said, "when you said that thing about her being elegant, that was a joke. What I said that night was genuinely a joke. But now it's not." Mason didn't look away from him. "No." Grant pressed his hand over his mouth briefly, a gesture Mason recognized. It was what he did when he was processing something that was running faster than his ability to sort it. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, looking somewhere past Mason's shoulder. "She knows you're telling me this?" Grant said. "No, I didn't tell her I was coming here tonight. I knew I needed to say it before anything else happened." "Before anything else happened," Grant repeated. He said it without specific inflection, which was somehow worse than if he'd raised his voice. "Grant, she's 60 years old, Mason." He said it like the number itself was an argument. "She's my mother." "I know." "You know." Grant stood up. Not aggressively, just moving, the way he moved when he couldn't sit still inside something. He walked to the window and stood with his back to the room for a moment. "What exactly are you— What is this? What are you even saying to me right now?" "I'm saying that I have feelings for her that I didn't expect, and that I haven't acted on, and that I came here tonight because I couldn't move forward with anything without you knowing. That's what I'm saying." Grant turned around. His face had settled into something Mason had seen rarely, a controlled expression that was the product of someone keeping several emotions from occupying the same space. "What about Lily? What about her?" "You have a daughter." "I know I have a daughter." "Does she know anything about—" "She's 6 years old, Grant. She doesn't know anything." "I'm not talking about—" Grant stopped. Started again. "I'm just saying, you have a lot to think about here." "I know I do," Mason said. "That's why I'm telling you, because you're in the middle of it and you deserve to know." Grant looked at him for a long time. The room was quiet except for the sound of the heating system and somewhere outside a car going past. "I don't know what to do with this," Grant said finally. "You don't have to do anything with it. That's not—" He shook his head. "That's not true. And you know it. You come in here and tell me you have feelings for my mother and then tell me I don't have to do anything with it? I mean tonight," Mason said. "I'm not asking you to be okay with it tonight. I'm just—" I needed you to know. That's all I came here for. Grant sat back down. He picked up his beer and set it back down without drinking it. He ran a hand through his hair. Does she... He stopped. Tried again. Does she have feelings for you? Yes, Mason said. Grant closed his eyes briefly. He opened them again and looked at Mason with an expression that was tired in a very specific way. Not sleepy, but worn. The expression of someone confronting a thing that has no easy category. I'm going to need some time, Grant said. Take it, Mason said. I'm not okay with this right now. I know. And I don't know if I... He stopped himself. Whatever came next, he seemed to decide not to say it. Mason stayed another 20 minutes. They didn't talk much. The conversation had done what it needed to do, and now it sat in the room, large and unsettled, and there wasn't anything else to add to it tonight. When Mason left, Grant walked him to the door and they stood there for a moment on the threshold, the way men do when something has shifted, and the normal goodbye doesn't quite fit anymore. I'm not going anywhere, Mason said. Whatever happens, I'm still here. Grant nodded. He didn't say anything. Mason walked to his car. He heard the door close behind him. He drove home through December streets, and the heater ran and the radio was on low, and he thought about Grant's face when he'd said, "She's my mother." Not just the words, but the thing underneath them, the complicated architecture of a man who had been raised by someone extraordinary and had never quite resolved how to feel about that, and who now had to figure out something new and harder. He thought about Victoria. He pulled into his driveway and sat for a moment. He picked up his phone. He typed to Victoria. I talked to Grant tonight. I needed you to know. He waited. 3 minutes later, his phone buzzed. How did he take it? Mason looked at the dark house in front of him. Lily asleep inside, the babysitter's car parked at the curb, the ordinary shape of his ordinary life. Not well, he typed. But he listened. That's something. A longer pause this time, then, thank you for telling him. I know that wasn't easy. He thought about what to write back. He thought about the coffee shop on Harrow and Fifth, and the gray October backyard, and the kitchen where she'd made tea and talked about competence becoming a wall you couldn't get back over. It was the only way, he wrote finally. I don't know how to do this any other way. Her response came after a moment, short. I know. That's part of why I'm not walking away. He sat in the car a while longer. The temperature had dropped while he was at Grant's. The first real cold of the season settling in, the kind that committed, that stayed. He thought about Lily saving up $14 for Hawaii to see the volcano. He thought about the way Victoria had listened to him in that kitchen without managing her face around the difficult parts. He got out of the car and went inside. Whatever was coming, and he had no real picture of what was coming, it had started tonight. He'd stepped out of the groove and into the unknown, in the way that things that actually matter always begin. Not with certainty, but with the decision that honesty was more important than comfort. He was not sure that had been wise. He was sure it had been true. And for now, in the particular cold of December, in the house where his daughter slept and the rest of his life waited for him to figure out its shape, that felt like enough to keep going. Grant didn't call for 9 days. Mason counted them without meaning to. It was the kind of counting that happens in the background beneath the surface of normal life. He got up and made Lily's breakfast and drove to job sites and filed reports and helped with homework and put Lily to bed, and the days went by. And somewhere underneath all of it, a part of him was keeping track. 9 days was the longest stretch in 23 years that Grant Sullivan had gone without contact. There had been a bad week after a breakup in college where Grant had essentially disappeared into his apartment and only resurfaced when Mason showed up with food. There had been a 2-week stretch when Grant's father had made a brief, unwelcome reappearance in his life, and Grant had gone quiet in the particular way of someone who needed to handle something privately. But even then, there had been texts, short ones, something that said, I'm still here, just dealing with something. This was different. This was genuine silence. Mason didn't push it. He told Grant he could take his time, and he'd meant it. And he understood, in a way that was uncomfortable precisely because he understood it, why the silence was happening. He would have done the same. He probably would have done worse. Victoria knew that he'd told Grant. He'd texted her that night in the driveway, and she'd responded. And after that, they'd exchanged messages a few more times in the days that followed. Short, careful things. Nothing that would feel like pursuing anything while Grant was still processing. She'd texted once to say she'd spoken to Grant briefly and that he had been polite and distant, which she described as a particular kind of cold I haven't felt from him since he was 17 and furious about something. Mason had read that text 3 times. On the 10th day, Grant called. Mason was in the middle of a site visit and sent it to voicemail, then stood on the second floor of an unfinished building for 5 minutes with the wind coming through the open framing, staring at his phone, before he called back. Grant picked up on the second ring. "Hey," Mason said. "Hey." Grant's voice was flat in a way that wasn't quite anger. It was the flatness of someone who had made some decisions about how they were going to handle this conversation and was holding them with effort. "You got a minute?" "Yeah, I'm on a site, but I can talk." A pause. "I've been thinking." "I know. A lot." "Grant, let me just—" A breath. "Let me just say this, okay? Just let me get through it." Mason leaned against a support beam and looked out through the opening where a window would eventually go. Below, the construction crew was doing something with concrete forms. The sky was flat and white, the particular winter white that had no specific weather in it, just cold holding still. "Okay," Mason said. "What you told me," Grant said. "I've been trying to figure out what I'm actually upset about. Because there are multiple things, and they're not all the same thing, and I kept mixing them up." Another pause. "One of them is that you went to coffee with her and didn't tell me." "I know. That one I can understand, like, logically, why you didn't, but it still bothers me." "Yeah, I know, that's fair." "The other thing is—" Grant stopped. Mason could hear him breathing, which meant he was walking, which meant he was pacing, which was what Grant did when he was working through something and couldn't make himself sit still. "She's my mother, Mason, and I know that sounds like— I know you know that. But the thing is, my mother is the most self-contained person I have ever met in my entire life. She doesn't need anyone. She has never needed anyone. She built everything herself and she raised me herself and she's run her company for 30 years and she's fine. She's always fine." Mason waited. "And you're telling me that she looked at you across my living room and asked you to dinner? My mother, who has never— In all the years I've been alive, I can count on one hand the number of times I've seen her want something she didn't already have." His voice had shifted slightly. Not softer exactly, but more honest. "And it's you. Grant, I'm not blaming you. I'm just saying, it's a lot." "I know it's a lot." "Do you?" The edge came back. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been having these conversations with her. These— I don't know what to call them." "Conversations," Mason said. "That's what they were. And the whole time I didn't know." 3 weeks, Mason said, keeping his voice even. "It was 3 weeks between the first time we ran into each other and the night I came over and told you. 3 weeks where I was still figuring out what was happening. That's not a long time, Grant." Silence. "You're right," Grant said reluctantly. "You're right. 3 weeks isn't—" He stopped again. "I just need to know something." "What? Are you serious about this? Like actually serious? Or is this—" He seemed to be choosing his words. "You haven't been involved with anyone since Claire. That's 4 years. And I get that. I completely get it. But I need to know if this is— if you're actually choosing her specifically, or if she's just the thing that happened to show up." The question landed harder than Mason expected. Not because it was unfair. It wasn't unfair. It was the right question. But because he'd been asking himself the same thing for weeks, and he'd been afraid of the answer in both directions. "She showed up," Mason said carefully. "I didn't choose this situation, but what I feel, it's not about proximity or timing or—" He stopped, started again. "She's the most direct person I've ever talked to. She talks to me like I'm an adult and she doesn't manage things around me and she makes me think harder than I'm used to. That's specific to her. That's not just something that happened to show up." A long silence on the other end. Mason watched a man below maneuver a concrete form into place, the labor of it visible even from up here. I need more time, Grant said finally. Okay. I'm not. A frustrated exhale. I'm not ending this, our friendship. I don't want to do that. But I need to not talk to you about this for a while. That's fair? And I need to talk to her. That's between you and her, Mason said. That's not my conversation. No, Grant said. It's not. His voice was tired. I'll call you. Whenever you're ready, Mason said. The call ended. Mason stood in the unfinished building for another 2 minutes before going back to work. The wind had picked up. He turned his collar up and thought about Grant's voice when he'd said, "She's always fine." The complicated thing underneath those words. The way a child could resent a parent's self-sufficiency even while being built by it. He thought about Lily, briefly. He thought about what it would do to her someday, when she was old enough to notice that his competence had its own cold edge to it. He hoped she'd know, underneath the competence, that it had cost him something to build. He went back to work. Victoria called him 4 days later. It was a Sunday afternoon and Lily was at the kitchen table doing a puzzle with her grandmother, Claire's mother, who came every Sunday without fail, and who had never, in 4 years, said a single thing that made Mason feel judged, which was a greater act of grace than he'd understood when it started. And Mason stepped out onto the back porch to take the call. I talked to Grant, Victoria said. I know, he mentioned he was going to. It was, she paused. It was one of the harder conversations I've had with him. And that's saying something because he went through a period at 19 where every conversation was a negotiation. How bad was it? He wasn't unkind, she said. He's been raised too well to be unkind. A small beat, which might have been irony aimed at herself. But he told me he felt like he was losing something he didn't have a name for, and that her voice shifted in the way voices do when someone is keeping something held carefully, that I couldn't really argue with. No, Mason said. You can't argue with that. He asked me what I wanted. What did you tell him? I told him I wanted to see where this went, honestly, without knowing in advance how it turned out. She was quiet for a moment. He didn't like it. Of course he didn't. He asked me if I'd thought about what it would look like, the optics of it. She said optics with a very specific dryness. I told him I'd spent 30 years building a company in a field where a lot of people had opinions about a woman running things, and that I had some practice not letting optics make my decisions. Mason almost smiled, and it hurt at the same time. How'd he take that? He said that was different, and he wasn't wrong, entirely. She took a breath. He also said that you were his best friend, and that and then he couldn't finish the sentence. He just said don't hurt each other and changed the subject. Mason closed his eyes briefly. The winter air was cold on the back of his neck. Where are we, Victoria? I don't know, she said. I think we might be at a point where we have to make a real decision. Not a coffee conversation, not a feeling things out kind of decision. A real one. What does a real one look like? It looks like both of us knowing what we're willing to take on, she said, knowing that this is going to be uncomfortable for a long time, knowing that Grant is going to need time and that time might be longer than either of us would like, knowing that, she paused, that you have Lily and that anything involving me involves someone who runs a company and travels and has a life that looks very different from yours. I know all that. I know you know it. I'm saying it out loud so we're not pretending we didn't. He sat down on the back porch step. Through the glass door, he could hear Lily and her grandmother talking, and the ordinary sound of it was so normal and so specific that he felt the distance between his two lives, the one inside that glass and the one he was currently navigating, as a physical thing. I want to try, he said. I know that comes with everything you just listed. I still want to try. Victoria was quiet for a moment. So do I. Neither of them said anything for a little while. The afternoon sat around them, cold, still, December doing its last few days before tipping into January. We should tell, not Lily, not yet, she's too young for... He stopped himself. But we should be honest. With Grant, with anyone who's going to be affected. We shouldn't hide it. I agree, Victoria said. Hiding things is exhausting, and it tends to make the eventual disclosure worse. Speaking from experience? Speaking from watching many people try it and fail, she said, and from one or two experiences of my own. Anything you want to tell me? Eventually, she said. Not today. He accepted that. Mason, she said. Her voice was different, slightly more careful, or slightly less careful. He couldn't tell which. I want to say something, and I don't want you to read too much into it. Okay? I haven't felt like this about anyone in a very long time, and I'm aware of how that sounds. I'm aware that I'm 60 years old and saying something that sounds like a line from a film, and I'm aware that this situation is Victoria. I just want you to know. I know, he said. I hear you. Silence. Okay, she said, pulling herself back to her usual register. Good. Yeah, he said. I'll call you next week. Okay? Take care of that daughter of yours. I always do, he said. The call ended. He sat on the porch step for a minute longer, hands between his knees, watching the bare trees at the back of the yard. He went back inside. No. January arrived without ceremony and things got harder. Grant's silence resumed. Not complete this time, but partial, the way sound is muffled rather than absent. He responded to texts eventually, and in one case they had a phone call about something work-related that Grant had needed advice on, and they'd talked normally for 20 minutes. And then at the end, Grant had gotten quiet, and Mason had felt the whole shape of the unspoken thing sitting between them again. Neither of them addressed it. The call ended. Mason stared at his phone. He and Victoria were talking regularly now, phone calls that lasted longer than they planned, and which had begun to have the texture of something real rather than something cautious. She called him on a Tuesday night when she was in Chicago for meetings, and he was standing in the kitchen after Lily's bedtime, and they talked for an hour and 40 minutes about things that had nothing to do with the situation, about architecture, because she'd been walking through a part of the city that had some extraordinary old buildings, and she'd wanted to tell someone about them, about the particular challenge of teaching a 6-year-old that failure was not a catastrophe, about whether it was possible to build something lasting in a culture that moved so fast nothing had time to acquire meaning. She asked him questions that took him by surprise, not the soft, therapeutic adjacent questions that people sometimes asked when they were trying to make you feel heard, but real ones, specific, sometimes uncomfortable, the kind that came from someone paying actual attention. She asked him once what he would do if he could do anything other than structural engineering, and he'd laughed and said he didn't know, which was true. And she'd said, "That's interesting. You seem like someone who would know," and he'd thought about it for 3 days afterward. He liked her. That was the thing underneath everything else. The simplest fact and the one that kept reasserting itself past all the complications. He liked talking to her. He liked the way she thought. He liked that she called things by their right names and didn't dress them up in softer language when it wasn't necessary. He liked that she laughed, not frequently, but genuinely, at things that actually struck her as funny rather than as a social performance. That was the part he hadn't told Grant, not the feelings, which he'd disclosed as honestly as he could, but this part, the simple, daily, specific part of genuinely liking someone, which was maybe the more honest version of what was happening. The problem arrived on a Friday at the end of January in the form of a text from Grant that said, "Can you come over tonight? I need to say something." Mason rearranged his evening, dropped Lily with Claire's mother, and drove to the Sullivan house for the first time since December. Grant answered the door. He looked, Mason thought, like someone who had not been sleeping well. Not a collapse, nothing dramatic, but a particular thinness around the eyes that Mason recognized because he'd seen it in his own mirror during the year after Claire died. "Come in," Grant said. They didn't settle into the normal configuration. Grant didn't offer a beer. He stood in the middle of the living room and Mason stood near the couch, and the room between them had a different quality than it had ever had. Not hostile, but tight. "I've been talking to her more," Grant said. "My mother." "Okay?" He stopped, pressed his hand over his mouth briefly. "I asked her why." "Not why you specifically. I asked her why now. She's 60. She has everything she built. Why would she?" He gestured vaguely at the space between them. "And she told me something I wasn't expecting."
Mason waited. She told me she was lonely. Grant said the words like they were heavier in his mouth than he'd expected. She said she's been lonely for a long time and she'd just gotten very good at organizing her life around the fact of it, and that talking to you was the first time in years that she'd felt. He stopped again. When he continued, his voice was rougher. She said present. That's the word she used. That she felt present. Silence. Grant, I didn't know, Grant said. That she was. I knew she was alone. I knew she went home to an empty house. I always figured that was fine for her. That she'd chosen it. That she preferred it. He looked at Mason, and there was something in his face that was honest in an uncomfortable way. The look of someone confronting the gap between what they'd told themselves and what was actually true. I'm her son. I should have. That's not your fault, Mason said. I'm not saying it is, Grant said sharply. I'm saying I didn't know, and I should have known. A beat. And then I had to sit with the fact that you knew, after 3 weeks of having coffee with her, you knew something about my own mother that I'd missed for years. Mason didn't say anything because there wasn't a clean thing to say to that. Grant sat down finally. He sat in the armchair and looked at the floor and was quiet for a while. Mason sat on the couch and let him be quiet. I'm not going to be okay with this right away, Grant said eventually. I want you to know that I'm not just. This isn't me giving you some easy blessing and everything goes back to normal. It's going to be weird for a long time, and I'm going to have moments where I hate it. I know. But I'm also not going to. He exhaled. She's an adult. She's 60 years old. She has the right to decide what she wants. And you're. He looked up. You're not a bad person, Mason. I know that. I've known that for 23 years. That's why this is so. He didn't finish the sentence. Hard, Mason offered. Yeah. Grant leaned back. You should have told me sooner. I know. And if you hurt her, Grant said, and his voice went very flat and very direct in a way that was entirely his mother's, but the genetic echo of it was almost startling. If you hurt her in any way that I think could have been avoided, I won't, Mason said. You don't know that. No, Mason said honestly. I don't, but it's not what I'm going in there to do. Grant held his gaze for a moment, measuring it. Then he nodded, a single, tired, provisional nod. Okay, he said. Okay? Don't make me say it again. Grant reached forward and picked up the television remote from the coffee table. Do you want to watch something or not? The normality of it, the sheer ordinary domesticity of the offer, hit Mason somewhere he wasn't fully prepared for. He sat back. Yeah, he said. What's on? Something mindless, Grant said. I've had enough serious for 1 month. They watched television for 2 hours. Grant got beers eventually. They didn't talk about anything important. At the end of the night, Mason put on his coat, and Grant walked him to the door, and on the threshold, Grant said, You should call her. Mason looked at him. Yeah? Don't make her wait around. She's not good at it. She pretends she is, but she's not. Mason nodded. Okay. And Mason? Grant's voice was still tired, but there was something in it now that was closer to solid ground. I'm still your friend. I'm going to need to figure out what that looks like now. We'll figure it out, Mason said. Grant closed the door. Mason drove home through streets that were empty and dark and cold, the way January always was at the marrow of it. That part of winter that didn't announce itself dramatically, but just pressed in, steady and constant. And he thought about Grant's face when he'd said she was lonely. The specific pain of a child discovering something true about a parent that reordered everything he thought he understood. He thought about Victoria. He thought about her in that kitchen making tea, saying competence starts to feel like a wall you built that you can't get back over. He hadn't known, that night, exactly what she'd meant by it. He'd thought he understood it then. He understood it better now. He was home by 11. Lily was at her grandmother's for the night. The house was quiet and entirely his, which was usually fine, but tonight had a slightly different quality. Not emptiness exactly, but space. Room for something that hadn't arrived yet. He sat at the kitchen table and picked up his phone. It was late. Later than was probably reasonable. He dialed anyway. Victoria picked up on the third ring, and her voice when she said his name had the slight roughness of someone who had been half asleep but was now entirely awake. "I talked to Grant," Mason said. A pause. "How was it?" "Hard," he said, "and then better. And I think—" He stopped. "I think we're going to be okay. Eventually." "Eventually," she said softly. "Yeah." He heard her exhale. Not quite a sigh. Something more like a release of pressure that had been maintained for a long time. "Mason," she said. "I know," he said. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. Outside, January held the street in its cold, still way. The neighbors' windows dark, the bare trees absolutely motionless, the world at its most stripped down. And on the phone, the quiet between two people who had just stepped past the last threshold into something they couldn't yet name, something that had no clear shape and no guaranteed ending, sat like held breath before a long exhale. "It's late," Victoria said. "I know. I'm sorry." "Don't apologize," she said. "I'm glad you called." Mason leaned back in the kitchen chair and looked at the ceiling of the house he'd learned to run alone. The house where his daughter slept some nights and his old life remained in every corner, and felt something that wasn't quite happiness and wasn't quite fear, but was something in between. The feeling of standing at the edge of something large, with your eyes open, having decided to go forward. "Dinner," he said. "Not coffee, an actual dinner. When you're back from wherever you're going next." A pause. "Boston. I'm in Boston next week." "After Boston." "After Boston," she said, and he could hear the shape of something in her voice. Careful, real, not dressed up. "Yes," he said goodnight. He sat at the kitchen table a while longer in the quiet house. Then he got up, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. The dinner happened on a Thursday in February, 12 days after Mason had called Victoria from his kitchen at 11 o'clock at night. He'd made a reservation at a restaurant he'd been to once before for a work dinner. Not fancy in a way that announced itself, but the kind of place that was serious about its food and didn't feel the need to explain why. He'd changed his shirt twice. He'd stood in front of the bathroom mirror for longer than he wanted to admit and said to himself out loud in the quiet house, "This is not a catastrophe," and then felt slightly ridiculous for needing to say it. Victoria was already there when he arrived, which he'd half expected. She was someone who was early to things. She told him once that being late was a form of telling the other person their time mattered less than your comfort, which he'd found both reasonable and slightly severe, which was accurate to her in general. She was wearing something dark, a deep burgundy, the kind of color that wasn't trying to do anything dramatic, but did it anyway. Her hair was down. He'd noticed, over the months, that her hair being down was a kind of indicator, not deliberate exactly, but readable, in the way that people who are usually composed have small tells that matter precisely because they're not manufactured. He sat down across from her and the waiter came and they ordered wine, and Mason looked at her across the table and thought, "Here we are." Not with dread, not with the electric nervousness of a 20-year-old on a first date, with something more like the feeling of turning a corner you've been approaching for a long time. The corner arrives and you're finally past it, and the view is different from what you imagined, and you're still standing. "You look nervous," Victoria said. "I changed my shirt twice," he told her. Something moved across her face. Genuine amusement, the real kind. "Which one did you start with?" "Gray." "This is better," she said. "That's good to know." He settled back slightly. "How was Boston?" "Cold and productive," she said. "In that order." "Good meetings?" "Complicated meetings that resolved better than expected." She turned her wine glass by the stem, a small motion. "We're acquiring a smaller firm. The due diligence has been thorough." "How many people does that affect?" She looked at him, and he could tell the question had registered differently than a polite question, like he'd asked something real. 63 on their side, about 20 on ours, in terms of role adjustments. It's not clean. It never is. No. She set the glass down. It never is, and anyone who tells you otherwise is either lying or hasn't done it enough times to know. She paused. I called every one of the senior people on their team personally, before the announcement, not because I was required to,
because I've been on the other side of that call, and I know what it's like to hear about your professional future from a press release. He watched her. That must have taken 2 days, she said, and it was worth every hour. She looked at him levelly. The company is not just the company. There are people inside it, and they have mortgages and children, and they came to work for a reason, and they deserve... She stopped. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to... Don't apologize, Mason said. I'm interested. You're being polite. Victoria, he said, when have I ever been polite at the expense of interested? She held his gaze for a moment. Fair, she said. They talked through dinner the way they'd been talking for months, without the managed quality of a first date, without the performance of people trying to present their best version. The food arrived and they ate, and the conversation moved around, and Mason told her about a project he'd been working on, a residential renovation in an older neighborhood where the original structure had been partially compromised, and nobody had caught it until his assessment, and now the whole timeline had shifted, and the clients were upset in the way clients got upset when the news was accurate but inconvenient. What did you tell them? Victoria asked. The truth, Mason said, that the alternative was worse. How'd they take it? About as well as people take things they don't want to hear. He picked up his fork. Which is to say, badly at first, and then they come around. They always come around, Victoria said, when the truth is the truth. Halfway through the meal, in a pause between things, Victoria said, Grant texted me yesterday. Mason looked up. He said, she paused. He asked if I was happy. What did you tell him? I told him I was working on it. She looked at him steadily. He said that was the most mom thing I'd ever said. Mason laughed, a real one, sudden, catching him off guard. Victoria smiled, and it was the kind of smile that didn't happen on command, the kind that started somewhere genuine and arrived on the face a half second after it was already true. He's trying, Mason said. He is, she agreed. He's trying in the particular way he tries things, with tremendous resistance and then, eventually, tremendous loyalty. He gets that from somewhere. She looked at him. Don't flatter me. I'm not, Mason said. It's just true. She looked down at her plate for a moment, and when she looked back up, something in her face was slightly different, more open or less guarded, or some combination of the two. I'm not good at this part, she said. What part? The part where someone says something true about me and I don't deflect it. She said it plainly, without apology or performance of self-awareness, just a clean statement of a fact about herself. I've had 30 years of practice redirecting attention back to the work. It's a hard habit. You don't have to break it tonight, Mason said. No, she said, but I'm aware of it. He looked at her across the table. The restaurant around them was full and warm and full of other people's conversations, and he was aware in a specific way of the distance between the public noise and the private conversation happening inside it. Can I ask you something? He said. You usually do. The divorce, he said. Grant's father. You've never... He measured this. You don't have to tell me anything, but I've put together some of it from things Grant said over the years, and I've noticed you never... Daniel, she said. His name, flatly, the way you'd say the name of a weather system that had already passed. His name was Daniel. She was quiet for a moment. He was charming and persuasive, and I was 30 years old, and I confused confidence for character, which is a mistake I made once and never again. She turned her glass. He left when Grant was 7. Officially when Grant was 8, that's when the divorce finalized. But really when he was 7 in all the ways that matter. I'm sorry. I'm not, she said. I was, for a long time, and then I stopped being sorry and started being, I don't know the right word, calibrated. I understood something about myself that I wouldn't have understood otherwise. What? She considered it. That I was capable of more than I'd been allowed to try. A beat. That the version of myself that existed inside that marriage was smaller than the one that was possible. The waiter came and cleared their plates, and the conversation shifted, and Mason didn't push further, but he held what she'd said in his mind, smaller than the one that was possible, and thought about the distance between who people were inside the structures they built for themselves versus who they were when those structures came down. He'd had his own version of that reckoning after Claire, the terrible freedom of being left with only the essential version of yourself. They stayed at the restaurant until the dinner crowd had thinned considerably, and the waiter had refilled their water glasses twice out of either professionalism or sympathy. When they walked out, it was cold. February cold, actual cold, the kind that arrived on the face with intention. They stood on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, and Mason thought about the October parking lot after the farmer's market, and the December coffee shop, and all the in-between spaces where this thing between them had been quietly assembling itself. "I'm parked 2 blocks down," Victoria said. "I'll walk you." They walked in the particular side-by-side configuration of two people who are close but not quite sure yet what the gesture vocabulary is. Not quite enough distance to be strangers, not quite close enough to be entirely comfortable. The street was quiet. Their footsteps were the main sound. At her car, they stopped. She turned to face him. Her breath was visible in the cold air, and the streetlight was doing the bad light thing again, where it showed exactly what was there. He reached out and took her hand. Just her hand. Something simple and declarative. She looked down at it, then up at him. "Okay," she said, quietly. "Okay," he said. He walked back to his own car alone, with his hands in his pockets and the cold on his face and something in his chest that was lighter than anything he'd carried in a long time. Oh, spring came in pieces. It always did in their city. Not a clean arrival, but a negotiation. Cold days giving ground to warm ones and then taking it back. Until sometime in late March, it just quietly stopped fighting, and the trees started doing what trees did, and suddenly the light was different. Mason and Victoria settled into something that didn't have a clean category. They saw each other when her schedule permitted, which was not as often as either of them would have chosen. She traveled frequently, worked hours that most people found alarming, and had the particular relationship with her own time that people developed after decades of being entirely in charge of it. She wasn't easy to schedule. She was also, when she was present, entirely present, which Mason had come to understand was rarer than it sounded. He drove to her house on a Saturday evening in March, and she cooked, which surprised him because she hadn't mentioned being able to cook, and she did it with the focused, no-commentary efficiency of someone who had spent years feeding themselves and one child and didn't consider it a particularly notable activity. She made something with chicken and lemon and capers and didn't make a production of it, and they ate at her kitchen table and talked, and the house around them was quiet and particular in the way of spaces that belonged entirely to one person. He looked around at her kitchen, the order of it, the specific books on the shelf visible from the table, the absence of children's drawings or accumulated family debris, the single coffee cup on the drying rack, and he thought about what she'd said months ago. "I thought it was time to have a home that was only mine." He understood it differently now, in the physical space of it. The home was only hers. It was also, in its own way, an honest portrait of what her life actually was. "What are you looking at?" she said. "Your kitchen." "What about it?" "It looks like you," he said. She followed his gaze around the room. "Is that good or bad?" "It's accurate," he said. "Which is good?" She looked at him with that expression he'd catalogued over months, the one that was slightly amused and slightly assessing and entirely engaged. "You do that," she said. "Do what?" "Say the thing precisely." She picked up her wine. "Most people round off. They say it's nice or it's cozy or something that's a compliment without being a description. You say what you actually see." "Is that a problem?" "No," she said. "It's just—" She paused. "I notice it." "Good," he said. After dinner, they sat on her back porch, smaller than Grant's, more enclosed, with a low fence and city sounds at the edges. He told her about a conversation he'd had with Lily that week. Lily had asked, with the directness that 6-year-olds deployed without any awareness of the weight of questions, whether Mason was going to get married again. He told Victoria this without fully deciding whether he should, and then it was out and sitting between them. "What did you tell her?" Victoria asked, carefully but without performance. "I said I didn't know. I said that right now I was focused on being a good dad, and that the other stuff was complicated." He looked at his hands. She said complicated was a word that grown-ups used when they knew the answer but didn't want to say it. Victoria was quiet for a moment. She's right. I know she's right. He glanced sideways. She's 6 and she's already right about most things. What's the answer? Victoria said, evenly. Not pushing, just asking, because she was someone who asked. Mason looked out at the enclosed yard and the night beyond the fence. I don't know what the answer is, he said, but I know that I'm not here because I'm practicing for someone else. I'm here because it's you. He turned to look at her. That's the honest version. She held his gaze. I'm not easy, she said. I know. I mean specifically, she seemed to be choosing words with unusual care. I have a company that takes most of what I have during the week. I travel constantly. I don't need to be taken care of, which can read as cold, and sometimes I don't catch it in time. She stopped. I'm not the version of a person that makes this uncomplicated. I know, he said. I have a daughter, and a dead wife, and a job that runs long, and I eat cereal for dinner more often than I'd like to admit. Neither of us is a clean situation. No, she said. Neither of us is. So we figure it out as we go, Mason said. Victoria looked at him for a moment in the March night air, and whatever she was measuring seemed to come back with whatever answer she needed because she nodded. A small nod, the kind that wasn't about agreement so much as about landing somewhere. Okay, she said. Os. The harder thing, it turned out, was Grant, not in the way Mason had feared. Not a blow-up, not an ultimatum, not a dramatic confrontation. Grant was too controlled for that and too invested in the friendship to risk it with something irreversible. The harder thing was subtler, the way a dynamic between two people could shift so gradually that neither one identified the moment it changed, just found themselves one day standing in a slightly different arrangement than before and not entirely sure how to find their way back. They still saw each other, they still talked, but there was a self-consciousness to it now that hadn't been there before. A slight management of topics, a careful choreography around what was mentioned and what wasn't. And Mason found it exhausting in a way that the original confrontation hadn't been, because the original confrontation had at least been honest. He drove to Grant's on a Wednesday in April. Unannounced, Grant opened the door looking slightly disheveled in the way of someone whose Wednesday evening had been plans free and comfortable, and who was now having that rearranged. I didn't know you were coming, Grant said. I know. Can I come in? Grant stepped back and let him in. They ended up in the kitchen rather than the living room, which felt right, more neutral, less weighted with all the configurations they'd sat in before. Mason stood by the counter. I need to talk to you directly about this. Grant crossed his arms. Not aggressively. Defensively, which was different. Okay. I don't like what's happening with us, Mason said. The last couple of months we've been careful with each other, and I hate it. I've known you for 23 years and you're my closest friend, and I hate talking to you like we're both trying not to break something. Grant was quiet. I know this is hard, Mason said. I know it's strange, and I know you're still working through it. But I need you to know that she makes me better at being present. She does that. And I'm not going to apologize for wanting that, but I also can't. He stopped. I can't lose this. He meant the friendship. They both knew it. Grant uncrossed his arms. He sat down on one of the kitchen stools and put his elbows on the counter and was quiet for a moment in his processing way. When he looked up, his face was tired and honest. She told me something, Grant said. Mason waited. She said, I called her last week, later than usual, and she picked up immediately. He paused. And she told me she'd been waiting for my call, that she always waited for my Sunday call, but last week she'd been waiting since Wednesday. He looked at the counter. She said she'd been thinking about me, about whether I was all right. Not in the way she managed things when I was a kid, not in a fixing way. Just, she was thinking about me. Mason watched his face. I don't know if I've ever been sure before, Grant said slowly, that she thought about me when I wasn't in front of her. That's a strange thing to say about your own mother, but she was always so focused on whatever she was building, and I was proud of her. I've always been proud of her, but there was always this thing where I wasn't sure. He stopped, started again. Whether I was a person she loved or a project she was invested in. The kitchen was very quiet. "Grant," Mason said. "I'm not asking you to fix it," Grant said quickly. "I'm not putting that on you. I'm just—" He exhaled. "She talks about you. When I call her, she works it in like it's nothing, like she's mentioning the weather, but she works it in. And the way she talks about you is—" He shook his head slightly. "She's different. I don't know how to describe it. She's still exactly herself, but she's—" He looked for the word. "She's less defended." Mason didn't say anything. The kitchen held its quiet. "I don't love this," Grant said. "I want to be clear. I don't love it. It's still weird, and it doesn't stop being strange. But she's my mother, and you're my—" He stopped on that word, regrouped. "You've been my friend longer than most things in my life have lasted, and I'm—" He looked at Mason directly. "I'm not going to be the thing that stands between two people I actually care about. I'm not built that way." He reached into the fridge and pulled out 2 beers. He set one on the counter in front of Mason. "But you're not off the hook," Grant said. "Not even a little bit. If anything—" He pointed with his beer. "You are on more hook than you have ever been in your life." "Understood," Mason said. "I mean it." "I know you mean it." Grant looked at him for a moment. Then something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly, but the structure underneath a smile, the thing that came before. "She told me you called her at 11 o'clock at night once." Mason felt his neck get warm. "That's from your driveway." "I was processing." "She said she was glad you called." Grant took a drink of his beer. "That's the part that got me. She said it like it was something she'd been keeping." He shook his head. "She's never said that about a phone call, in my entire life." Mason looked down at the counter. "Take care of her," Grant said. It came out quiet and direct and with a weight that had nothing performative in it. "That's all. Just take care of her." "I will," Mason said. They stayed in the kitchen for another hour, and somewhere in the middle of that hour they stopped being 2 people managing a situation and became, again, 2 people who had been friends for so long that the friendship was practically structural, load-bearing, the kind you could trust with weight. It wasn't fully repaired. It was going to take time, and there were going to be moments where the strangeness reasserted itself, and Grant was right that it didn't stop being strange. But something essential had been returned to its right place. He drove home with all 4 windows cracked despite the April chill, just enough air to feel the season coming in. The trees were going. That negotiated spring was finally settling into something real, something committed, the way springs always eventually did when you stopped trying to predict the timing and just let them arrive. At home, Lily was asleep. He checked her door, the nightlight, the sideways sprawl, the blanket, and then he stood in the hallway for a moment in the quiet house. He thought about Victoria in her kitchen that had her particular order to it. He thought about Grant saying she's less defended. He thought about Lily asking whether he was going to get married again, with the directness of someone who didn't yet know that some questions were supposed to be handled around the edges. His phone buzzed. A text from Victoria, late. "Grant called tonight. We talked for 40 minutes. I think we're going to be all right." He stood in the hall and read it twice. He typed back, "Yeah, I think so too." He went to bed. Sleep arrived for once without a long wait. The house was quiet. The spring was coming in outside, doing what springs did, not announcing itself, not making promises, just slowly, steadily becoming undeniable. And in the morning, there would be Lily and breakfast and the ordinary machinery of a life. And somewhere in that ordinary machinery, a shape was assembling that hadn't been there before, incomplete, unfinished, without guarantees, but real. That was the thing about real things. They didn't need to be complete to matter. They just needed to be true. The first official date, the one they both later referred to as the actual first date, as distinct from the February dinner, which had been more of an arrival than a beginning, happened on a Saturday in early May. Mason had planned it with more effort than he showed, which Victoria either didn't notice or chose not to comment on, and both possibilities seemed equally likely. He'd made a reservation at a place near the water, one of those restaurants built into the side of a converted warehouse that had floor-to-ceiling windows
and served food that was serious without being theatrical about it. He'd arranged for Lily to spend the weekend with Claire's mother. He'd gotten to the restaurant 15 minutes early, which was not characteristic, and sat at the bar with a glass of water and thought about nothing in particular, which was actually him thinking about everything without organizing it into sentences. Victoria arrived in a gray coat he hadn't seen before. She was 4 minutes early. She looked at him at the bar and said, "You're early." "You're early," he said. "I'm always early." "So am I, apparently." She sat down next to him, and they both looked at the room for a moment, which was filling in its unhurried Saturday way, and the water was visible through the windows, flat and gray-green in the May evening light. "This is strange," Victoria said. "Yeah," Mason said. "Not bad strange." "No," he agreed. "Not bad." They got their table and ordered, and the evening settled around them into something that was, for the first time, uncomplicated by the weight of what needed to be said or disclosed or managed. Everything that needed to be on the table was on the table. Grant knew. Lily didn't know specifics, but had absorbed, in the perceptive way of children, that something was different and hadn't found it threatening. The people in their lives had been told, or would be told, and the telling was mostly done. What was left was just this. A table near a window, two people who had spent 6 months circling something real, and the particular quality of an evening that didn't need to be anything other than what it was. Victoria told him about the acquisition. It had finalized the previous week. 58 people absorbed, 5 roles eliminated. Every person in those 5 roles offered alternative placement within the combined company, which was not contractually required and which she'd done anyway. She talked about it the way she talked about her work generally, with precision, without false modesty, and with a specific moral seriousness about the people-level consequences that she never made into a speech. "Did all 5 accept?" Mason asked. 4 did, she said. 1 had been looking to leave anyway, and used it as an exit with a reasonable severance, which was probably the best outcome for everyone, including him. She paused. "I had coffee with him, before the announcement, just to understand where he was." "You didn't have to do that." "I know I didn't have to." She looked at him. "I've spent 30 years watching people run organizations like they were machines with human-shaped parts. I've always thought that was a category error." "It is," Mason said. "Yes," she said. "It is." They ate and they talked, and somewhere in the middle of dinner the conversation shifted from work and logistics and found its way into the less navigated territory of things that were actually personal. Not the things they'd covered in all the months of careful disclosure, but the smaller, quieter things that only surfaced when you weren't bracing for them. She told him she'd had a garden at the old house, Grant's house, that she'd let go slowly over the years and then completely after Grant left for college, and that she sometimes missed it in a way that was disproportionate to what a garden was. He told her about the way he still sometimes drove a route home from work that had been Claire's favorite stretch of road. Nothing scenic about it, just a particular corridor of old trees, and that he'd never once told anyone he did that, including Grant. "Why not?" she asked. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Some things feel like they belong to you and the person who's gone, like sharing them with someone else would make them smaller." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "I understand that," she said. Then, "Does telling me now make it smaller?" He thought about it. "No," he said. "You're different." "Different how?" "I trust you with small things," he said. "That's harder than trusting someone with big things, usually. Big things you disclose because you have to. Small things you only give to people who won't do anything with them except hold them." She looked at him across the table for a moment. The restaurant noise wrapped around them, and the window showed the water going dark in the way water did when the light left it. Not black, just a deep, still version of itself. "I've been thinking about Lily," Victoria said carefully. Mason watched her. I'm not trying to." She stopped, recalibrated. "I want to say something, and I need you to tell me if I'm overstepping." "You can say it." "I would like to meet her," Victoria said. "Properly. Not as Grant's mother, who was briefly in a room, as whoever I am to you now." She held his gaze. "But only when you think she's ready, and only when you're sure. I'm not in a hurry.
I'm saying it so you know it's something I want. Mason set his fork down. She's been asking about you, he said. Victoria blinked. She doesn't know who I am. She doesn't know specifics, Mason said, but I mentioned I'd been having dinner with a friend and she asked what the friend was like, and I said, he stopped. I said she was smart and direct and didn't round things off. And Lily said, that sounds like how you are, Dad, and then she went back to eating. Victoria was very still for a moment. She's 6, Mason said. She's also, I think, going to be fine. Victoria picked up her wine glass and looked at it for a second. When she set it down, her face was slightly different. Not undone. Victoria didn't come undone easily, but moved. Something had moved through and left its mark. Okay, she said. Okay? Okay, she said again, steadier. When you think it's right. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the same simple gesture as that February night outside the restaurant in the cold, and she looked down at it and then up at him with the expression he'd come to know as her version of entirely undefended, which was not soft exactly, not sentimental, just open, cleared of management. We're going to be fine, he said. She didn't say you don't know that the way she might have 6 months ago. She said, yeah, I think we are. The meeting between Victoria and Lily happened 3 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon in late May, at Mason's kitchen table. He had not staged it. That had been a deliberate decision. He'd considered a neutral location, a park, or somewhere that felt less loaded, and then decided that neutral locations for important things had a way of making the importance more obvious, and therefore more pressurized. The kitchen table was just the kitchen table. Lily did homework at it. Mason drank coffee at it. It was the least ceremonial surface he owned. He'd told Lily that morning simply, a friend of mine is coming for lunch. Her name is Victoria. She's important to me. I want you to meet her. Lily had looked up from her cereal. Is she your girlfriend? Mason had paused. Yes, he said, because rounding it off would have been exactly the thing Lily had diagnosed months ago, the thing grown-ups did when they knew the answer and didn't want to say it. Lily had absorbed this. Is she nice? She's very direct, Mason said. She says what she means. Like you? A bit. Okay, Lily said, and went back to her cereal with the equanimity of someone for whom the information had been processed and filed and didn't require further immediate discussion, which was sometimes alarming and always impressive. Victoria arrived at noon. She'd brought nothing, which Mason had specifically told her. Don't bring something, it'll feel like an audition. And she had listened because she was someone who listened to specific requests. She was dressed simply, nothing that announced itself. She stood on his front step with her hands in her coat pockets and looked slightly less composed than usual, which was the most honest thing he could have seen. Hey, he said. Hey, she said. He stepped back and let her in. Lily was in the living room, cross-legged on the floor, with something spread out around her that appeared to be a project involving cardboard and paint and an ambitious geographic scope. She looked up when they came in. She looked at Victoria with the direct, uncurated assessment of a child who hadn't yet learned to be subtle about looking at people. You're Victoria, Lily said. I am, Victoria said. You're Lily. Yeah. Lily looked back at her project. I'm making a map of all the volcanoes. The active ones? Victoria asked. Lily looked up again. All of them. But I'm doing the active ones in red. That's a good system, Victoria said. Color coding. Dad uses it too, Lily said. For work stuff. She held up the map toward Victoria. There's one in Iceland that's been erupting for like 100 days. Victoria crouched down, not the way adults crouch to get to a child's level as a performance of connection, but just actually getting down to see the map better. She looked at it. Fagradalsfjall, she said, or one of that system. I flew over Iceland 2 years ago, and the landscape from the air looks like the planet is still figuring out what it wants to be. Lily stared at her. You flew over a volcano? I flew over a country that has a lot of them. Did you see any lava? Not from the plane, but I could see the black fields, the old lava, cooled down, stretching for miles. Victoria looked at the map. You've got the Pacific Ring of Fire marked. That's ambitious for a Sunday. I've been working on it for 3 Sundays, Lily said, with a slight note of dignity. It shows, Victoria said. She didn't stay crouched there too long. She stood up, and she and Mason went to the kitchen to make lunch, and Lily continued her map, and the afternoon assembled itself in the unremarkable, load-bearing way that real things did. Not with any grand gesture or pivotal moment, just with the steady accumulation of ordinary minutes that meant something. Lunch was sandwiches. Mason made them badly, in the way he always did. Too much of some things, imprecise about others. And Victoria didn't offer to help and didn't critique, just ate and talked to Lily about the Ring of Fire and where exactly in Hawaii the lava actually entered the ocean, which Lily knew because Lily had done research. At one point, Lily looked at Victoria across the table and said, "Are you going to come here a lot?" Victoria glanced at Mason briefly. Then, "I hope so, if that's okay with you." Lily thought about it. "Do you like volcanoes?" "I like people who are interested in things," Victoria said. "You qualify." Lily accepted this. She picked up her sandwich. "Okay," she said. Mason looked at the table. His daughter, this woman, the ordinary mess of a Sunday lunch, and felt something that didn't have a single clean name. It was not uncomplicated. Lily would have questions as she got older, and some of them would be hard, and this was still new enough that it could still go sideways in ways that couldn't be predicted. Victoria was not a replacement for Claire, and would never be asked to be. The age difference would be noticed by everyone who encountered them, and some of those people would say things. None of that was resolved. It was all still there, in the background, the way the difficult things always were. But at the kitchen table, in the particular light of a late May Sunday, something was also simply true. They were all right. The 3 of them, at a table covered in sandwich crumbs and within sight of a cardboard volcano map, were genuinely, imperfectly, entirely all right. Summer arrived with its usual indifference to timing, and things settled into a rhythm that wasn't entirely stable, but was entirely real. Victoria came to the house on Sundays with increasing regularity, and occasionally on a weekday evening when she was in the city and Mason's day had ended at something resembling a reasonable hour, and twice they went to things that were neither one's idea of a good time. A school fundraiser that Mason couldn't skip, and a company event of Victoria's where Mason stood in a room full of people who knew exactly who she was and tried not to look like he was doing math about the situation. And they navigated both and came out the other side intact, which was its own kind of evidence. Grant came to dinner at Mason's house for the first time in July. It was a Friday, and Victoria was there, and the 3 of them were in the same room together for the first time since the October night that had started everything. Mason had cooked better than he usually did, more carefully, which both of them probably noticed and neither mentioned. And they sat around the table, and it was exactly as strange as expected, and also gradually, as the evening went on, less strange than that. Grant was quiet for the first half hour. Not hostile, just processing, in his particular way, the visual reality of something he'd known about in the abstract. His mother and his best friend at a dinner table together. He looked at them and Mason could see him filing it, sorting it, trying to find the right shelf for an image that didn't fit any existing category. "This is weird," Grant said at some point during the meal, to no one specifically, just to the air. "Yes," Victoria said. "I'm going to need everyone to acknowledge that this is weird." "It's weird," Mason said. "Thank you," Grant said. He picked up his fork. "Okay, what are we eating?" "Chicken," Mason said. "Is there something wrong with it?" "No." There was a long pause before you said that. "The sauce didn't come together the way I—" "It's fine, Mason," Victoria said. Grant looked at her, then at Mason. Then he made an expression that was somewhere between pained and something that was going to become eventually a story he told at dinner parties for years. "I need more wine," he said. "I'll get it," Victoria said, and stood up and went to the kitchen. And Grant watched her go and then looked at Mason with an expression that contained about 7 different emotions in imperfect combination. "She knows where your wine is," Grant said. "She's been here a few times. She knows where things are in your house." "Grant, I'm not—" He held up a hand. "I'm not saying it's bad. I'm saying it's strange. Those are different things. I can hold both."
You're doing great, Mason said.
I really am, Grant said, which was also the beginning of him finding it funny, which Mason could see in the slight shift around his eyes, even while the rest of his face maintained its wounded dignity. I want it noted that I am handling this with tremendous maturity. Noted. Future generations will marvel at my maturity. Victoria came back with the wine bottle. She poured Grant's glass without being asked, which was either intuitive or she'd been watching the evening more carefully than she appeared to, and both were probably true. She sat back down. They finished dinner. They had dessert, which was store-bought because Mason's ambition had run out at the main course. Grant and Victoria talked about something to do with the Sullivan house, a repair Grant had been putting off that Victoria had opinions about. And Mason listened and watched them and thought about the particular architecture of what he was seeing. A mother and son navigating a new configuration of their relationship in real time in his dining room with imperfect tools and genuine care. When Grant left at the end of the night, he stood at the door and put on his coat, and Mason walked him out, and on the front step Grant stopped. She laughed twice tonight, Grant said. Mason waited. At dinner, twice, and not the polite kind, the actual kind. Grant looked at him. I haven't seen that in a long time. He was quiet for a second. I didn't know how much I was missing it until I saw it. Grant, don't, Grant said, not unkindly. I'm not trying to make this into a thing. I'm just saying. He put his hands in his pockets. You're good for her. I can see it. I hate that I can see it because it would be easier not to, but I can see it. He looked at Mason directly. Don't waste it. I won't, Mason said. Grant nodded. He walked to his car. He didn't look back, which was also characteristic, because Grant never looked back at doorways. He always just went, which Mason had once asked him about, and Grant had said, if you look back, it means you weren't sure you wanted to leave, and if you weren't sure, you shouldn't have left. Mason stood on the front step until the car was gone. The July night was warm, and the neighborhood was the kind of quiet that only happened on weeknights when summer had settled in and everyone had adjusted their rhythms to the heat. Somewhere down the block, someone was running a sprinkler. He went back inside. Victoria was in the kitchen, rinsing dishes. He leaned in the doorway and watched her for a moment. The quiet, domestic normalcy of it, which was not something he'd imagined 6 months ago as a thing that would feel significant, but did. He said you laughed twice, Mason said. She didn't stop rinsing. I heard. The window was open. I know. She set a dish in the rack. He's going to be all right. Yeah, Mason said. He is. She turned off the water and dried her hands and turned to look at him. They were in his kitchen in the warm July night, and through the window the sound of the sprinkler was faint and rhythmic, and everything was exactly as it was, no more and no less. Mason, she said. Yeah. I'm happy. She said it like a fact she was reporting, plainly without decoration. I want you to know that. I don't say that lightly, and I'm not saying it to perform anything. I am. He looked at her. So am I, he said. Trust. 10 years is a strange amount of time. Long enough that things you thought were temporary turned out to be structural. Short enough that you could still, on a particular afternoon, or in a particular slant of light, feel the distance from where you started as a physical thing. Mason was 42 now. He thought about that occasionally, not with dread, but with the specific consciousness of someone who had lost enough to understand that time was not abstract. Lily was 16 and insufferably competent, and had grown, over those 10 years, into a person who was both familiar and genuinely surprising, which was the best outcome of parenthood that Mason could have articulated. Victoria was 70. She'd stepped back from day-to-day operations at Sullivan Meridian 2 years earlier, so not retired. She found the word slightly offensive, but shifted. She consulted. She sat on boards. She came home more often and worked strange, concentrated hours, and had more Sundays free than she'd had in 30 years, which she was still, honestly, getting used to. They had not gotten married. This was a conversation they'd had twice. Once seriously, once slightly less seriously, while drinking wine on the back porch of a house they'd both come to think of as theirs, which was technically Victoria's, but which Mason and Lily had moved into with enough of their own objects and habits and Sunday routines that the distinction had softened into something more honest. The first conversation had been Mason asking. The second had been Victoria asking. Both times they had arrived at the same answer. It wasn't the piece of paper they needed. What they needed was already present. The house, the Sunday rhythm, the dinner table where Grant came every few weeks. The fact that Lily called Victoria 5, which had started as a shorthand and calcified into something that meant more than any formal title could have. They had what they had, and it was real, and real things didn't need the same scaffolding that uncertain things did. Lily was 16 and had her own complexity with Victoria. Not difficult, but layered in the way that adolescence layered everything. She respected Victoria, which was not a small thing. Lily was 16 and she didn't respect things by default. She had, over the years, absorbed things from Victoria that Mason noticed without always being able to name. A particular directness in how she handled disagreements, a habit of doing the thing that was right rather than the thing that was comfortable, a tolerance for being underestimated while working quietly past it. One evening, about a year earlier, Lily had come home from school with a look on her face that Mason recognized as the look of someone who had been told something about herself by someone who did not know her well enough to say it. She'd sat at the kitchen table and Mason had waited, and eventually Lily had said, "Maddie said that V isn't really family because you guys aren't married and she didn't raise me." Mason had opened his mouth, but Lily had kept going. "I told her that family wasn't about documents and it wasn't about biology, and it was about who showed up and what they did when they got there." She looked at her hands. "V taught me to play chess last winter even though I was terrible at it for a long time. She read every one of my history papers before I turned them in, and she never just said they were good, she always said specifically what worked and what didn't. She calls me on my birthday before anyone else." Lily looked up at Mason. "She's family. Maddie doesn't know what she's talking about." Mason had not trusted his voice for a moment. Then he'd said, "Have you told V that?" Lily had looked at him like this was obvious. "I'm telling her tonight." That evening, Mason had found himself in the kitchen making dinner while the particular quiet of the house settled around him, and from the living room he could hear at low volume Lily and Victoria on the couch. He couldn't hear what they were saying exactly, just the sound of it, the rhythm of a conversation between two people who had built something between them over years, out of chess games and history papers and early birthday calls and 1,000 small accumulated choices. And he had stood at the stove for a moment with his eyes briefly closed, just listening to the sound of it. Grant was 42 now too, and still came to dinner every few weeks, and had developed, through gradual accretion rather than any single moment, a relationship with Mason and Victoria together that was its own thing, distinct from his relationship with either of them separately. He brought wine and complained about work, and was a genuinely good uncle to Lily in the way of a person who had decided, eventually and deliberately, that love was a resource you could choose to expand rather than a fixed quantity that got divided when the configuration changed. He still called it strange, occasionally. Not with pain, just with the residual acknowledgement of what it had cost them all to get here. "This is still strange," he'd say, usually when something made the configuration particularly visible, a holiday, a photograph, the way Mason and his mother moved around each other's sentences at dinner. "This is still strange, but I'm glad it's this," which was about as much as anyone could ask, Mason thought. Glad that it's this, rather than the alternative. That was enough. That was more than enough. It was a Sunday afternoon in October, 10 years and 3 weeks, roughly, from the night in Grant's living room, when Lily brought it up. She was home from school for the weekend, 16 and unhurried, in the way that teenagers were unhurried on Sunday afternoons when no one was asking anything of them. She was sitting on the back porch with her phone and a blanket, and Victoria was at the table inside reading something with her reading glasses on, which she had finally accepted she needed and which she wore with neither vanity nor performance. And Mason was bringing coffee out because that was something he did on Sunday afternoons. He set a cup down for Victoria, who looked up and thanked him with that particular look she had, specific, unhurried, the one that was just for him and had been for 10 years. And he went to the porch door and passed a cup through to Lily, who accepted it without looking up and said, "Dad." "Yeah." "Do you remember when it started? Like, the actual start?" He looked at her. "October," he said. 10 years ago.
What happened? I made a joke, he said. A careless one. Lily finally looked up. What kind of joke? I said, your grandmother. I said Victoria was more elegant than anyone I'd ever dated. He could still hear the sentence in his own voice. That particular evening, the leather couch and the game on and Grant looking at him with preemptive horror. To Grant, trying to be funny. Lily processed this. And she didn't think it was funny. She thought it was real, Mason said. She asked me to dinner. Lily looked back out at the yard. The October yard, stripped down again the way October yards always were, the oak tree at the back doing its annual accounting of leaves. And then what? And then everything was complicated for a long time, Mason said. And then it wasn't. That's not a good story. It's not a complete story, he agreed.
The complete version is long. Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, was it worth it? All the complicated parts? Mason looked through the glass door at Victoria, who was reading with her glasses on, entirely absorbed, entirely herself, in a house that had over 10 years become, in every way that mattered, theirs. He thought about Grant at that first dinner in this house, saying, this is weird, and meaning I'm trying. He thought about Lily on the back of this same porch at 6 years old, saying I'm lonely sometimes and being honest about it in the way that children were honest before they learned to protect themselves from their own admissions. He thought about Claire's road and what it meant to carry a loss with you not as a wound, but as a truth. Something that happened, something real, that lived alongside everything that happened after. Yeah, he said, without question. Lily nodded. She went back to her phone. The matter was resolved. Mason went back inside. He sat down across from Victoria with his own coffee. She didn't look up from her reading immediately, which was fine. He didn't need her to. He looked at her reading and at the Sunday afternoon light coming through the windows and at the kitchen where they had made approximately 500 meals together by now, and thought about a careless sentence on an October night a decade ago that had traveled through months of careful and costly honesty all the way here. The thing about careless sentences was that they were sometimes more honest than the careful ones. You said something without thinking, and the true thing inside it landed somewhere real, and then you had a choice about what to do with that. You could laugh it off and let it dissolve. You could be embarrassed enough to bury it, or you could follow it. Victoria looked up. She found him watching her and didn't look away. What? She said. Nothing, he said. Just looking. You're thinking about something. I was thinking about the joke, he said. She lowered her reading, which is the origin story you tell Lily about how this started. She asked today. Victoria tilted her head slightly. What did you tell her? I told her I made a careless joke and you didn't find it funny. Victoria looked at him for a moment, the faintest shape of a smile. I found it real, she said. I know, he said. That's what changed everything. She held his gaze across the kitchen table. Outside, the October afternoon was doing what October afternoons did, going golden and slightly melancholy, the light at that particular angle that made everything look a little more itself, the kind of light that showed the actual structure of things, the branches underneath the leaves, the bones of a season that knew exactly what it was. Mason, she said. Yeah. I'm glad you stayed to make the joke. He laughed. It came out easy, the real kind. I almost left earlier. I know, Grant told me. She picked her book back up, but she was still looking at him over the top of it. He said you were always trying to leave early. He talks too much. He does, she agreed. It's one of his better qualities. He smiled at her across the table. She almost smiled back, the full version, the one that hadn't been easy for her to give for most of her life, and which she'd been giving more of, gradually, over 10 years of Sunday afternoons and early phone calls and imperfect dinners and the honest, sometimes costly work of two people choosing each other past the point where it was easy. The house held its October quiet around them. From the porch, Lily's blanket rustled. There was no grand resolution, no final moment where everything clarified into something clean and complete. Real things didn't end that way. They just kept going, forward, through the next complication, and the next Sunday and the next October, because that's what the real things did. They persisted. What Mason understood now, at 42, that he hadn't understood at 32, was this. Love wasn't a feeling that arrived and stayed. It was a direction. You pointed yourself at someone and kept pointing, through all the confusion and cost and ordinary difficulty of two lives trying to occupy the same space. You didn't stop pointing when it got complicated. You pointed because it was complicated, because the person was real and specific and worth the honest work of actually knowing. You followed the careless sentence into the careful years. And that, in the end, was the whole of it. Outside, the October light held as long as it could, which was never long enough. And then, as it always did, as everything always did, it began its quiet, unhurried change.